Good day. We are welcoming you all to this space on climate change has deep impact on the lives of people, exacerbating environmental threats and having an impact on the economy and socially as well. In case of Central America, forest fires and droughts worsened by extractivist practices like deforestation and illegal fisheries affect the more vulnerable communities to favor the where these infrastructure projects take place or extractivist destroying means of life. In this context, freedom of press is essential to inform the population and to support free information on the factors and conditions that expel people from their territories, and the answers they find are vital to understand and measure the impact in Central America. Once again, we welcome you. This is a conversation that is a continuation of the tour that Alianza Americas did in May of this year, and in which these three journalists participated in whom are accompanying us. This will delve into the more recent climate effects that took place this year, like the rains in El Salvador and the heat wave in Honduras. This is supported by a Latin America Working Group. We remind you that we have simultaneous interpretation to English, and for more information regarding freedom of press and the situation of climatic justice in Northern Central America, and also to know our advocacy agenda, we invite you to go through these documents that are available for you. So without further ado, we welcome you and give the floor to our moderator, Dr. Ana Patricia Rodriguez, to begin this conversation. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. We welcome all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here with Alianza Americas and these fabulous journalists whom I've had the privilege of meeting in their previous tour. I'm Professor Ana Patricia Rodriguez. I'm a professor at the Spanish and Portuguese department in the in the University of Maryland. And so today we will have a conversation on climate change, displacement, and independent freedom of press in Central America. I remind you that we have the simultaneous interpretation from Spanish to English. To activate this, you can click on the globe icon that should be below your screen and choose your language of preference. It's a great honor to be able to introduce these journalists that are accompanying us today in this space. We will be talking today with Elsa Coronado, Guatemalan journalist with Maya Kekchi roots, whom since 2013 has dedicated herself to research journalism. In 2017, she started publishing in Plaza Pública. She covers justice, democracy, indigenous peoples, climate change, following on public expenses and human rights, among many other important topics. We also have the presence of Marcia Perdomo, Honduran journalist she's been working for 2 years for the online edition on El Heraldo since 2010. And since September of 2020, she works with Criterio.hn, where she researches on the extractivist model and its impact on human rights in the indigenous peoples, vulnerabilized peoples, and the general society in general. We also have with us Victor Peño, photojournalist, producer, and videographer. He's Salvadorian. He's photography coordinator at El Faro. His work has delved around migration in Central America, Mexico, and the United States, gang violence, political corruption, victims of the Guatemalan armed conflict and in El Salvador, and the violations of human rights. It's a great pleasure to have you here in this space with us. As we have heard, the intersection between climate change and freedom of press shows crucial challenges that our societies are facing in a very complex democratic context. Freedom of press is not just a tool, a political tool, but it's also is essential to guarantee our right to information and our survival. Now, we in this space we will be after each presentation we'll have 3 rounds of questions, and now we'll start with the first presentation. I believe is Elsa. Yes, go ahead.
Gracias, buenas tardes.
Thank you. Good
Gracias
afternoon. Good
por
morning.
tenernos aquí
Thank you
hoy.
for having us
Estuvimos
here once again.
participando
We
en el tour
participated in the
y
with the tour in
tuve la
May, and
oportunidad de
then
compartir
we
con
were
varias
able to
personas
share with
sobre esta
many
temática
people,
sobre la Sierra de
including
Maryland,
students from the Maryland
lo que
University,
hemos hecho en nuestro
regarding the
país y
coverage we've been doing in our
entonces
countries, and we
podemos llegar a
talked about the
conclusiones
coincidences that we might
de
have
lo que estamos viviendo, ¿no?
on what we're living through. I would like to show real quickly a few images that will
Acerca
help
de
me
lo que se
talk
vive en Guatemala.
about what is happening in Guatemala.
El área que yo he estado dando
In the
cobertura es
area
la
that I've
zona
been
costera
covering regarding climate
y los
change
efectos que tiene sobre
and
la
its
seguridad
effects
alimentaria de las
on food
personas,
security
pero
of the
también
people,
sobre sus
people's food
enfermedades
security, but
físicas
also their
y
physical
pues en
security.
este
Because
momento
many of these, I
mi
love
esposo
this picture
vive desde
because it
1995.
shows
Él
Don
vive
Guillermo
en
Chiquin's
Panzós,
family. He lives
Altaveras,
in Panzos, Alta
Quechí,
Verapaz. It's a
y
municipality in the north of
conocemos
the country of
especialmente.
Quechí
Y
population,
una de las
precisely.
cosas
And one of
que quisiera
the
contarles
things that I would like to talk
sobre el
about
maíz es
is
que
that they
no
live
tienen
off of the
una
corn,
tierra
basically.
para
That's their
sembrar,
means of
no tienen
life.
dónde sembrar
To have
y su
land
más
to be able to
importante
grow
plan
is
es sembrar
corn
desde 2020
is the
cuando
most
tuvimos
important
los
thing.
huracanes ETA e IOTA.
2020, with the Eta and
Estuvimos
Iota storms, we
vimos que el
saw that the
Colochic se
river, the
apodera
Kolochik River,
de los terrenos donde
takes
cultivan
over the
y esos
lands where
lugares en
they
donde tenían
work.
la posibilidad de sembrar
So,
2 o 3 veces al
where they
año
had the
perdieron
possibility to
la
grow
oportunidad
corn 2 or 3 times a
ya
year, the
no
land is no
tienen las
longer
oportunidades
yielding.
de comer
So, they have
alimento
less
básico.
possibilities to have
Y
food during the
todos
year.
saben de
Generally, they
que
talk about a
de falta de
season
alimentos
of lack of
durante
food. This
esta
happens
temporada.
every year, but it
Aquí
is
hemos
intensified because these
aprovechado
extreme
que
rains have
las
produced the Kolochik River
lluvias
to
posteriores
derail
entonces
on their
los
lands,
enlaces medioambientales
overflood on
están
their lands. So
afectados.
there's
¿Por qué?
very
Porque se
strong
da principalmente
climatic
por
threats, but
condiciones de
strengthened
vulnerabilidad que ellos ya tienen
because of
antes
vulnerability, the vulnerabilities,
que
historic
pues ellos
vulnerabilities that they have been facing,
la
which is extreme
mayoría
poverty,
siempre
which forces them to
aparecer en los mapas de
come
desnutrición
up in
del
the
país,
uh, lack of
adicional
nourishment
de que estas
maps in the
poblaciones
country. So, because of this, many of these
están
populations cannot
atentos
be
al su
left
desarrollo. Entonces
stranded
ellos
for
se
someone
movilizan
to
hacia
support
diferentes
them. So,
comunidades
they
fincas
make internal
de este aspecto
mobility
del área de
to
Colochic
the
se da
farms. This has
mucho
happened in
sobre
Kolochik, which is a
todo
very hot
porque
area. It's a
ellos
humid area,
viven
38 degrees
y en
centigrades,
condiciones
and
preocupantes,
in
sin
worrisome
agua,
conditions.
sin servicios
Um,
básicos. Todas las familias
Dirt
participan en los procesos de
floors without the
autorreferencia.
basic needs. All the family
Entonces,
participates
de
in
esa manera es
the
como los
growing and
finalmente
cultivation of
llegan las
crops.
inundaciones
And
y cuando
when
están sobre
the
unos
floods
islotes es porque
take place, as you can see,
necesitan
they're on stilts.
que
And precisely
se pueda
because they
cultivar
need to
así
protect that
cuando
food as much
no
as
se da
possible.
el
When the
agua
storms
del
come
río
and
y
the
les inunda,
river floods their homes, they have to hang everything, and that is the only way in which they might guard their food. Many of these families are afraid of the river. There's fear because if the rains are too strong for 2 or 3 days, this would imply that the Colochic River's edge will overflow. So many of the families have to cross the river to be able to exit and remain safe. I visited these communities again in June of last year, and I found stories of people who told me this building that you see on the left of your screen is the place where they could seek and find shelter in when it was too much rain, and that they remember clearly that 2.5 meters tall, which are how tall the stills are, the water reached there during Eta Nayota, and they had to be taken out in boats and travel long distances to remain safe. So, listening to the fact that they're survivors of these tragedies is of huge impact. But more impactful is that their situation hasn't changed through time. So, I believe that these types of reports that I did in June show us what are the losses, what is the harm that they've been accumulating throughout their history, and that we have an institutionality that is not able to reach for them to find a solution to their issues. In these communities, there's no access to basic services. Water is hard to get, and whenever the floods take over everything, the few water wells, are damaged. We're now in the rainy season in Guatemala, and this season carries on consequences of the um, dry season that lasted up to June of this year, and in which they depend on to be able to grow crops. And facing the lack of institutionalities, there's a palm plantations, which you can see at the end, and that is the only support they can obtain, like a machine that could help them fix the land or to be able to build protection at the limits of the river, so to avoid overflooding to the homes. So there's constant effects accumulated through time. This is the case of one municipality in the country. There's 340 municipalities, and here I'm only telling you about one that is also located in one of the area where the development indicators always turn out very poor because development is not able to reach those places. My apologies that at the beginning I didn't start with the question you'll be answering, the journalists will be answering, and the activity of this conversation is that a series of 3 questions, and each of them will answer reporting. So the first question that Elsa already answered, but that Marcia and Victor will continue with, is that starting from the reports, how do you just register the environmental threats that have an impact on the communities, especially in migration, immigration, and access to historical resources? And we've heard a little bit about the situation in Guatemala. So I think that now, if I'm not mistaken, we'll continue with Marcia. Hello, Ana Patricia. It's great to share space with you once again. I don't know if you could share the slides and start with the video. I promise it's short. Honduran extractivism. And so in this video, we're able to hear and see what we're told from the territories, how the populations are living, the advancement of the extractivist industry in Honduras. Criterio.hn, since its foundation, because of corruption of many of these extractivist projects that have come into the country, has seen extractivism and its impact, how this is worsening the climatic situation in Honduras because they're using water resources and minerals are extracted, open sky mining, which has an impact in our sources of water, so, and also the production of food. Also, these communities are made vulnerable because they're not asked if they want these industries to come into their lands. And what they ask, what they call a consultation, they state that their final will be employment, but they're not informed on the impact that open sky mining will have on their sources of water or their means of life, their ways of life. So what we see with the extractivist industry are climatic damages, environmental damages, damages to agricultural production. In Honduras, agricultural production has come down. Honduras now imports lettuce, tomatoes, mostly from Guatemala. So whenever there is an impact in Guatemala, we also feel it in Honduras. And in part, production has sped down in Honduras because of the lack of incentives. The communities, seeing that they're not able to produce, two things happen to them. They are displaced to the cities in the country, or they remain in the territories. And this has two consequences. When they come to the cities, this ends up in migration to the United States, Guatemala, and Mexico, but mainly the United States, or those who remain in the territory begin a struggle to protect their territories, and they end up being criminalized, stigmatized, judicialized for supposedly usurping in most of the cases, charges on usurping in most of the cases, because they're defending the territory that they had grown on for a long time and under which they had lived in. So in the case, for example, of one of the reports that we presented from Criterio was that this anarcho-capitalist project Prospera in the Roatan in the Honduran Caribbean. And as such, it's a model city with all the implications this has, which is the loss of sovereignty. Thank you very much, Ana Patricia. You're welcome. And now we'll continue with Victor. Hello, good morning. It's great to be here. Ana Patricia, it's great to greet you once again. Thank you to those that are present here in this session to talk a little bit about the region. Regarding your question, see, I think if we talk in migration terms, historically, the region has been a victim and protagonist of a phenomenon that has been very constant for many reasons for years. For me, migration summarizes all of the crises that the region goes through: violence crisis, financial crisis, economical crisis, lack of access to basic needs, and inequality that have been produced by the armed conflict itself. And in the last few years, we've seen a tendency that precisely deals with the climatic conditions, something that has changed so much which have been more threatening, and that obviously comes to affect the more vulnerable communities in the country, in the region, but in El Salvador specifically. It really has an effect on the populations that are more vulnerable and who have suffered these previous phenomena. The same ones that were victimized during the armed conflict, the same ones that have been victimized by gangs, the same ones that haven't had access to better employment, the same ones that face vulnerable conditions are the most affected one when climate has more of an impact. So adding to that, the lack of interest from the state itself right now in mitigating all of these problems, especially in the communities that are more urgent. In El Salvador, previously, there was an articulation or an organization from the communities to be able to prevent some disasters. The government annihilated, we could say, all of these systems, and what it does right now basically is that they have all the concentration of communication and mitigation. And obviously, if you're working from the capital city, there's no direct reaction to the more remote communities in the country. And previously, the communal leaders did this work, who did this work, were able to evacuate the people. And now that we depend on a government that wants to be a protagonist of the whole situation, carry a victor's flag. And so we faced situations in El Salvador where the risks are not managed, the risks the population is facing. So it's a government that is more interested in their communication strategy than in mitigating risk. And we can see this with cases in which they're simulating the idea of rebuilding that countries like Japan or China might have. You've seen a video that circulates really quickly where they say, no, in Japan, in 2 days, they were able to rebuild a bridge that was destroyed because of storms, that type of publicity. So the government, to simulate this effectiveness, is using that technique as well. But that might take months to fix a very small bridge that fell down from a community, but then using all their machinery is divulged as a work as work they did in 3 days to solve the issue. So far from it, that propaganda, we keep seeing cases of people who lose their crop, cases where people have been killed in the recent rains that we've had, cases in which, for example, people have been left with more vulnerabilities but have not been solved. They're still there and they are not mitigated because we're facing a situation in which the authorities prioritize more the propaganda campaigns. Thank you very much, Victor, Elsa, and Marcia. Now we're moving on to the second question. And before that, we want to invite our audience to include their questions in the chat so that they might answer these at the end and the interventions from each of the journalists. So please include the questions on the chat. The second question that we want to discuss is what barriers are journalists facing in Central America while informing the impacts of climate change and the environmental degradation. And if you could also respond and answer on how freedom of press could be strengthened in each of your countries. I'm going to begin. As I'm discussing this, I will be presenting this video that we worked on recently. But we could say that there are different reasons to say that there are difficulties today to be able to do these types of coverages. Something important is that in Guatemala, for example, we have difficulties in accessing information very often. We have a law that allows us to have information to data through requests, but very often to be able to understand these realities or what are the government actions in these communities, where the budgets should be assigned to be able to do different activities, like forest conservation, handling of water sources, infrastructure, and social development. Very often, this information is dispersed. And we had a huge culture in the country of blocking information. We changed government this year, but still we're still facing these difficulties in some of these places. There are still some that are in charge of uh, communicating information that limit the access. This is a difficulty we face, right? And for us, it is very important to reach these communities because they even say that they have no possibilities of communicating with their situation with their own voices in the organisms that should be listening to them. There's these development councils in Guatemala that allow smaller communities to have a participation in the discussions of the mayor's offices, and that these voices are raised to different levels that should reach the governors and the departments, and then to the tables where the central government representatives are there. And many of their requests don't reach those places. So historically, they are left with the same issues throughout the years, not having roads, not having access to water, or that they have not been tended to be relocated. In the area that I'm talking about, which is the AKG area in Alta Verapaz called Panzos, historically they're crossed by the land conflict. The populations did not have access to land. There's a huge history there on how these territories, large swaths of land, were ceded to foreigners so that they might produce in these lands. But the smaller and original populations were left without land. This has also been difficult to cover historically, and we could say that we still trust that these circumstances might change, that the spaces to obtain information might be open, and that there is tolerance from the governments regarding any questioning that takes place. Often they expect only good news to come out regarding what they're doing, and almost 7 months of the incoming government, they have to understand that our job is to look on at what they're supposed to do or what they're supposed to fulfill. And they don't always receive with good eyes these questionings. So it's a challenge to do our job. So we're not there only to observe the efficient work they might be doing or to report that the previous government left a huge debt, but really to find out what it is they're going to do in the position they're at to tend to the problems that from journalism we're presenting. Unfortunately, they're not always in the agendas of all the media. We are currently covering the justice system election, which has also been co-opted. So that is huge weakness there. And there's a lot of tension there. And as this is being solved, we have to remember what communities are facing critical situations. And in our countries, a little bit of rain could become a disaster, not because the climate event is producing it, but because of the situation that these communities have been living through. So what do we expect? Well, communities where we usually have the blockage of information historically is what we see, that they share the information from the government, that journalist is seen as an ally to transmit what is happening. These people have their own voices. Unfortunately, they are not heard. And very often, we are able to be that media so that their stories have a wider response. And once again, I repeat, currently, and I'm not only talking about the president, there's Congress people, there's mayors, governors, fun, employees of the different government institutions. Whenever one of them does not want to provide information, there's a blockage there, and we have to pay attention on that. To do these types of assignments, for example, I would like to tell you real quickly that doing journalism requires a lot of effort, physical, emotional, but also economical. To cover news in these places where are 6, 7 hours away from our offices requires transportation time. So it's not simple. And we also, when we reach the communities, we realize that they're expecting something else from them. So if I tell you all of this, what are you going to give me? Or what is going to happen to me? So it's a huge load that journalists have to carry. Journalists who do the coverage have to carry. So because very often we don't have an answer for that, for them. So in general terms, I would like to say that the conditions improve, but there have very big transformations. And to be able to happen, for this to happen, we have to be able to continue doing our work. And finally, that people make themselves understood. So whenever a new case of someone who's been affected comes to light, it's not because we want to harm the government. It's just that we don't want to be quiet on what is happening. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elsa. Marcia, if you could please tell us now about the barriers that journalists are facing in Honduras. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ana Patricia. I'll repeat Elsa's words. The same situation is happening in Honduras, and I'll add to this that those who in Honduras, what happens in Honduras, the journalists are killed. Threats are not many, but the main thing is that they end up being killed. To this, we'll add that those who carry more danger, those who are living in the communities, they face more dangers because they know what's happening in the communities and they are threatened and end up being killed. So repeating the law on access to public information, Honduras has a law on access to public information, but the problem is that it's not fulfilled. And regarding environmental topics, the reservations of information regarding environmental topics have been growing. And this happened with the previous government, and it's getting worse with this one. I'll explain about a specific case later on. That is a damage to access to information. So, because if we don't have information, what do we have? Presumption, hypotheses. We don't know what is happening with the extractivist project, who own these, which ones have license to exploit resources, who provided it. So a clear example is the building of a prison in the Cisne island that is 150 kilometers away from Honduras. And this is the current government repeating the president of El Salvador's policy. So what do we know about the Islas del Cisne project? Well, the project has been questioned by general population, not only because of the environmental damage that it will produce, but also because it opens up the doors. Because this is direct purchase, it opens the door open wide for corruption. Government, regardless how many people from the academies, environmentalists, indigenous people, different peoples have complained about this, and what the answer, the response is that this is a security issue, and from the impact of the environmental impact study, which was filtered, it states that is not feasible, but there's endemic groups of animals there that are going to be harmed. So this is an example of how information is reserved because they don't want to provide not even the amount of money that will be spent. It's under reservation. And we're not saying that we want the plans of the jail. What we They say that no, it's under reservation, it's reserved. But people have to know we're not being told who will be in charge of the building because they don't want to be upset by it. That journalists are going to upset them, we're not sure, or that the gangs might try to obtain information. That was not all that clear. Thank you very much. My apologies. Thank you, Marcia. Now, Victor, if you could please talk to us about the situation in El Salvador. Thank you. See, the situation in El Salvador has become more complex. We already had those behaviors from the previous government that was directed by the left in the country, and there were indicators of hiding information, but we had guarantees. There was breaks for these behaviors from a constitutional court, and the Congress people from their positions fought for more transparency. After Bukele's government came to being, what we have suffered is a complete blocking of access to public information, not only regarding environmental projects, not only regarding topics that will have an effect that has a lot to do with climate crisis. During the pandemic, all the public information of the health ministry was blocked. So we can't know exactly how they handled with the pandemic. They hid information regarding deaths from COVID-19 and the purchases because they declared a state of emergency, and there was no intermediary who could follow up on the purchases. So what we know and what the government is executing right now is nothing because there is no access to information which we could reach. So the government was following the policy of saying, believe me, because this is my plan. But the government wants us to believe in plans that we don't know about because we don't have a drop of information. And adding to that, although public officials didn't want to share information, there was a lot of people with the journalist work, having sources from which you could get information, we were able to get the information parting from that. So what has this government's behavior that is now illegal and was authoritarian from the get-go, basically people are now facing fear based on the exception regime under threat of weapons. So, although there are deep worries in different communities, lots of people are afraid of talking to journalists, or they're afraid of coming out, they're afraid of being mentioned in a news article because they're afraid of that the government might do something to them, captured, and may be accused of illicit association or being part of a terrorist group. And that's so the exception regime is now a rule for everyone. Everyone is afraid now. And although this is a blockage for journalists, so it's complicated from the public portals and from the obligation that public officials have of providing information. So it's difficult to get information because everyone is afraid. So in this sense, we are facing a government that is behaving, but I think this is a very Latin American tendency, and we see it in Europe as well with a lower level, but in Latin America, it seems that public officials reach power believing that they own the country. And they state that they are right, and they've established this logic that the government is facing threats from journalists. The president has over 6.5 million followers from Twitter or X, which is called now, and that is more than the discussion that a this makes it so that their truth, his truth, is absolute. And as Marcia was saying as well, this has been transmitted to other countries in the region. Guatemala was implementing this in the previous government. Honduras has implemented almost a copy of this, and this is a very hypocritical behavior from the governors, especially from the president in Honduras, who struggled against a legally elected president. And basically, the practices are the same, and they're applying or betraying their principles because they complained about this behavior before from Juan Orlando Hernandez. And they use that to obtain credibility to the population. And with that same tool, they're attacking their populations, they're attacking journalists, and they're implementing situations in which it's more and more complex to face in the region, not only on climate change, but in every sense. Here we have an exception regime. There was a plan for territorial control that we never knew about, that we never really heard about. There's a lot of disinformation. This has been blocked for 7 years. So we cannot know exactly how the Secot jail was financed. We don't know exactly what enterprises built it because there's no report on that. We know obviously that this was built by certain enterprises because they do their work, because we do the research elsewhere and find it in different means, but it's becoming complicated in every sense because there's a very articulated strategy in the countries in the region of sending a message to populations that journalists are the ones that were damaging the development of populations. And I think this will make the struggle more difficult until there is a more conscious population, more aware that public officials are lying to their faces. Thank you very much, Victor Marcia Nelso, for talking about depression and the attacks that journalists are experimenting in their countries. We know that in May you had a tour in Washington, and the question now would be, after doing the tour in Washington and the multiple of exchanges that you've had with the members of Congress, the academy, and civil society, if you could please share a little bit with us your impressions, questions that we might have, if you perceive there is an understanding on the situation of your countries and the role of the press. And at the same time, what could we do here so that there might be more involvement and a better understanding on what is happening in Central America? So we'll begin with Elsa and then with Marcia and Victor. Thank you. Well, the experience of being in Washington and sharing with different people, the work that we've done, what is has been left clear for me is that we're not really aware on what exactly happened in our countries. We're a smaller region, Guatemala. There's only 18 million people, and I say only because compared to other territories, but in ours, in that little space, many problems find each other. And when I was presenting the images, many were surprised that things like this were happening. This could be a different continent, but not a territory in America. So I found those very interesting reactions, and I would expect these contents to be shared more by more people. And the other one is that we have a Spanish speaking population and people who read, because as you see that our reports are multimedia, there's photography, video, we have text. Now we also have the social media aspect. So there's a consumerism of obtaining things much faster. And these reports are done really to read a little bit slower. So we found that one of the challenges would be for people to be able to read long texts. We do a lot of efforts for people to know about social media, but that's not the full story. So that was my experience sharing these types of things. And also the topic is that the thing is that we talk about climate change. Yes, temperature change, it's hotter now, the dry season is much longer now, and we've been living through that in the whole world. There's people still who reject the idea that this is due to climate change. Scientists have confirmed it. So what we're doing now is recovering those stories, and we place them in these reports. It's interesting how many people received them. Some people were shocked, and others thought that it would be difficult for people to consider people being in extreme poverty situations, like the pictures that I've shared show. And I also think that what we need right now is to sensitize people through these reports, because at the end of the day, the citizen power, it lies in demanding information from public officials so that the budgets that are assigned to them can be used for something. And also the will of people is moved, the good disposition of certain people to help their peers. On the way here, I was not able to talk about this. We also have issues, and I mentioned briefly difficulties of people who don't have any private property. These are people who are precisely indigenous, and especially in this Quechua region. So I believe that when I was doing this report in June, we also visited a community that was evicted and who were living under the trees, covered by these tarps made from nylon and sleeping on the floor. Many people I will try to help them. And this moment, I think I need to recognize the competent authorities visited, did a field visit to the the place. And of course, what really made me feel sorry, for lack of a better word, is that they took so long to visit the needs of these population who was facing critical and humanitarian crisis. And as a matter of fact, the situation has not changed because more decisive answers have to be have to take place and for these to be more holistic. So it helps us a lot that readers and help us share that information and with their opinions and the doubts that they're left with or the impressions they're left with when they've had access to this types of information. Those who listen to us from foreign lands out of Central America, but also let us know what happened to your countries. Many of you left your family there, friends. It's your land, right? So I do think it's of your interest to know what happens in the case of people from Guatemala, Guatemalans. There is a very strong link, and we show this here with all the financial support their families receive. So part of those remittances end up nourishing the national budget, and from that budget, support to these communities in some of their needs should take place. And also to clear up, these communities move, they work, they're under the sun, working for their own food, but also finding solutions to what they might do. I was very saddened by one of the people who we interviewed said, we don't have any studies, but we imagine that there might be solution to this. We don't know who could make a study here, who could tell us what to do. They don't want to live in those conditions. They don't want to lose the land in which they're living in. So it's not that they laid their hands down and that they don't want to do anything to solve their own difficulties. Thank you, Elsa. And if Marcia, could you tell us about your impressions, please? Thank you very much, Ana Patricia. It's interesting how we're three countries with defined borders, but we're facing the same difficulties. I think that the difficulties the United States is facing addressing these climate situations are similar to what happens in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and the rest of Latin America, because whenever there's people with lots of knowledge in the United States and Honduras, the argument when this is addressed is that they're against development and investments. I think we forget that development without dignity and is not good for the populations. And we see this whenever a storm is coming, crops are flooded, or other cases like the ones Elsa mentioned at the beginning. Tegucigalpa, there was rain, but after raining, it was so hot, terrible hot heat. So the environment topic, it goes unnoticed. And farther you get from the region that is facing these consequences, less known about it. Press in the United States and Honduras really doesn't have a policy, an agenda to cover these types of news. And it's just talking about climate change. But what is producing climate change? Let's look at this. Let's do an inventory on what it is we're doing for climate change. And there's no process for training for journalists to address environmental news. And even it also happens in Honduras, and I would imagine that the United States, the owners of the corporative media are have investments in extractivist projects. like it happens in Honduras. They're going to research themselves. They're going to allow their journalists to do research on the projects they're doing that are taking away water from communities, land from communities. They can't produce, they can't drink water. This is not going to happen. There is a case that I think Ana Patricia has really followed on, which is the case of the Carlos Escalera Mejia mountain. It's open sky mining, produces harm, environmental harm in the water, and there's knowledge of this, but this open sky mining is still driven. And if I could say that recently the court, the constitutional court and the Supreme Court um, voted on the side of the Sabah community so that there's no more mining in their municipality. They're part of the Carlos Escalera Park. The harm that you can see in Tocoa and you can see in Hualaco Lancho is still there. So we need not only the cancellation of the projects, but also how to recover these lands that were damaged. The same thing happens with recently, precisely because of a iron ore mine that was also in the Carlos Escalera. There was a spillage of iron ore in a protected area that is close to the Castilla port in Colón. And the DA went and they established this is a spillage of iron ore. But yeah, what are we going to do about it? Thank you very much. This is so terrible. So we'll continue with Victor, please. I think that during the tour, many have identified in the country, especially in the last few years, because of the type of president we have, that now everyone's paid attention to the figure whom is now a dictator, because in June the 1st, as he was confirmed as such, breaking all democratic rules, which has already called on the attention in the institutions in the United States. There's people paying lots of attention. The point is, whenever we see these conversations, people know about this, the breaking of the democratic process, knowing about the violation of institutions, to breaking or the unification of the state powers under the hand of one person, but there is no interest, or there's a lot of lack of knowledge, especially in the fundamental problems that the country might be facing. So there's lots to the United States tries to stop migration from the countries in the region to there. So, but there's lots that is still not known on the processes of things that are directed for health and education. If you have countries that are not being educated with the best budgets or the best programs, what you'll have in the future is a society that has no access to other things like employment and better condition, which is really what societies are asking for now, to access work, for example. So there's lack of knowledge of these problems. And the problem here is that you might be very much worried about democracy, but people who does not have any money in the day to day, they don't really care about democracy. They don't know about it. People does not know that Bukele broke all democratic norms to stay in power. People don't know that there is a constitutional court. People don't know that in the more vulnerable communities don't know about the three powers of the state. So countries there try to take care of democracy and diplomatic relations, but basically based on issues that really only interest the public officials, but they don't really benefit the population that is undergoing all the effects that take place after breaking constitutionality and democratic processes that end up affecting communities. I believe that there should, and I know there's institutions who are doing strong work to reach the communities, to understand these problems, but that I believe that more is needed to address the social topic, for example, and what is happening in all of the communities more so than what public officials are doing, because obviously public officials from the current government, there will come a time when they will end up um, overtaking the effects when they find that there's no real answer once to the problems. It will be just one more politician that went through power. They will have the same story that right and left politicians, right wing, left wing politicians have faced in the country. They will be hated by the population. And during in that game, that discussion in the organizations, institutions, or the countries really saying that they care more about democracies, we'll continue having these discussions, and the bottom line problems will not be addressed because it seems that we're always behaving the current politicians' democratic attitudes, but the more fundamental issues are still there. El Salvador migrated in 1960, 1950. Then there was a spike in the 80s. Then there was a spike in the post-war and the pandemic. And there's other migration elements because more than being a cool and extraordinary country promoting the same block in the historical center, El Salvador has issues that have not been solved. So if we don't understand all of the fundamental issues, we will continue facing this same story 40 years later with another politician will be doing better or worse things than what we're seeing right now. Thank you very much to all four of you. This is a long conversation. There are so many things left pending. Unfortunately, our time is due. We did not want to, we didn't want to leave any questions unanswered that are left by the audience. We perhaps could answer two questions if someone would like to answer. We apologize with the rest because there's a whole bunch of really good questions and their conversations really are left with lots to think about. The first question, the first comment comes from Vicky Cass. She's saying, thank you all for this great panel. You are very brave for your work and bringing to light that the governments and people need to see. All three countries have had important changes in the government in the last few years. The Honduras, the laws and detention of a narco president, the election of Arevalo in the Guatemalan spring, and the illegal re-election of Nayib Bukele. And Vicky's question is, what should be the role of the diplomatic community to each of the countries in the different governments? And all three journalists, the question is, which would be the levels of corruption in your national and local governments that make the amount of disasters grow? These are very complicated questions. If anyone would like to answer, please go ahead. Well, in my case, in the case of Guatemala and this coverage that I've done, it's amazing how a river, for example, could produce so much fear in many families, and a river that is necessary. And that we also say, you talk about natural riches, but during the throughout time, the storms and the pandemic, Eta and Iota, plus the 2020 pandemic, and those funds destined to public works that these are used so organizations could execute their expenses quickly, and there's nothing left of that. So corruption really goes through us. And many of these cases are not investigated. There's something else there. We go to the DA's office to request information about those cases, and they're not provided. So this is a very huge difficulty. And regarding the international community, it's, to be honest, there's a huge challenge in Guatemala because everything became divided. Many have very high expectations so that they might exert pressure. Others don't really expect anything because those visa cancellations do have an impact, but they don't really end up producing a transformation. So, on what we've seen and what other organizations have done regarding like financing communities, we have institutions that are dedicated to food, community development, etc. Perhaps that could be some form of support. Hello. I'm going to add my 5 cents on the topic. In Honduras, corruption is endemic. Well, in the region, really, it's always there. And we can see this in how governments, after the coup d'etat, but previous to the current Xiomara Castro government, and well, the narco trafficking that we have, the Juan Orlando, they basically did concessions on the whole country, allowed concessions. If you look at it, almost more than half the country has concessions, has been concessions have been given to extractivist companies. So what what the current Xiomara Castro government is saying is that yes, the country was left indebted, but then what are we doing to solve the problem? Something else. Regarding the Cisne Islands, it is clear that just seeming to solve the security issue, they're saying it's not a natural reserve but there's documents from 1991 and 1994. They're saying that it's not a natural reserve. So what is this discourse that yes, we're going to change, but the previous government really tied everything up, but I'm also producing other issues regarding diplomacy, the said as the model cities, the charter cities, as they're known. The U.S. Embassy has been really damaging. Any steps forward that could have taken place has been rejected, and because it continues being something about being against development and this and even in fiscal issues and fiscal evasion issues. No, the embassy has written a communique talking to the press about it, establishing a behavior. So the rest of the, not all the entrepreneurs, but those from the corporations who are in the topic, they feel emboldened. So fis- fiscal justice, we're going to elections again, and this has not been able to become law. Thank you. Thank you. And if Victor could please close. I believe that the levels of corruption are high, and that is a very regional, very Latin American behavior. But I think that obviously politics or the new public officials have been learning from old practices, how there's always campaign promises for transparency, that the elections will be fair, but then power involves other people of decisions that are agreements with groups that have that dominate also public opinion. They dominate the decisions of the government. And that is why we see politicians in Guatemala involved in drug dealing, in agreements with organized crime in Honduras, which is a constant practice. Congress people who have an open profile who have been accused and that openly talk about their relations. In El Salvador, right now, there's no proof of this, but there's proof of the agreements or that contracts to building companies are receiving contracts without any licitation process. This is a very Latin American practice because the population in Central America and Latin America is not aware that a public official is under their control. And it is the population who comes in or who goes out to direct the policies in the countries. So we're requesting time, we're living through a time where public officials behave in a very, very similar manner. They don't really care anymore that they are denounced in the media. They don't really care about the organizations denouncing them, and they're working under that guise. Congresswoman in El Salvador, Claudia Ortiz de Banos, is the one who has brought to light on how the contracts from the budget they have monthly, and no congressperson of the official side, nor the president himself, have really spoken about this for transparency to so this woman saying this is what we receive because there has been complaints from the population on their expenses and these ghost hirings from the executive branch. They're all quiet. They're all in this situation, and there's no clear answers for the population. So, in this sense, it seems that nothing is happening. Okay, so these words, nothing is happening, and the status of all three countries. Unfortunately, we have to finish, we have to close, but we'll invite you to continue this discussion and be attentive to what is happening in Central America and also watch over journalists, take care of journalists. So we're going to have to stop here. We apologize for not being able to answer all the questions that we've seen on the chat, which are all very good questions. And thank you once again to Elsa, Victor, Marcia for what they have shared, which has been so important. And this conversation was sponsored. Thank you to the support of the Latin American Working Group and Refugees International. We thank the participation of our audience that is here. We have about 63 or more people with us. We invite you all to uh, go through Alianza America's recommendations. This material has been prepared regarding freedom of press and climatic justice in Mexico and Central America. And you have the link to see which are these recommendations. And before closing, I want to invite you all, we want to invite you to our upcoming session of the webinar sessions that Alianza America is having. This will be titled Vulnerability. My apologies. Vulnerabilities, cross vulnerabilities focused in childhood, which will take place on August 14th, that we have shared in the chat as a link and previously as well. And once again, thank you so much. And we'll be attentive and please stay safe and well and secure. Thank you so much for your work. Journalism matters. Thank you so much. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. It's great to see you all.